Today we're going to wrap up our lecture on migration and look at why people migrate within a country. But before we get to that, the next several slides that have review on them cover the first two lectures that we've done on migration and would be a great review going into the quiz that you have either for A-Day on October 13th or B-Day on October 16th. So I would take the time to pause this lecture and go back and review those, look at your notes, or do that when you get ready to study for your quiz. So the voice is going to stop at this one, skip over until you get to new content after review slides. So I will be with you guys in just a minute. Why do people migrate within a country? For centuries, a lot of people migrated looking for better land to farm or for economic opportunities because places were getting too overcrowded. Since the late 1800s in Europe, the United States, and now in developing or periphery countries, most people are moving from rural areas into urban areas to look for economic opportunities because that's where the jobs are. In the United States, interregional migration initially is going to be with the move west with Manifest Destiny. When people were looking to find more land as the country expanded and as the population grew, there are waves of this migration that happened. Initially, the majority of the population density was on the eastern seaboard, close to the colonies in Britain and Spain, so you could get goods back and forth relatively easily, good transport to market. Then, as time goes on, people start to move to the interior, past the Appalachian Mountains into the Midwest. As the population starts to expand, we gain more land, people will start to migrate west through the Great Plains to the West Coast. And more recently, you have the Great Migration south because of more job opportunities, as well as the great climate that a lot of people tend to prefer, as opposed to the more extremes that you have in the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic, not so much the Mid-Atlantic, but then also the Northeast. Over the U.S.'s history, the center of the population has changed. So it's kind of the average location of everyone in the country. So it's where the population distribution is kind of like on a flat plane, kind of like almost like you could line up push pins and that would be the center population. In 1810, Loudoun County was the center of U.S. population. It doesn't migrate to Ohio until 1860. Until 1980, the center of the population was Missouri, and it still is today. So it's taken a long time to get to the population for the center to move. Internal migration, we talked about this a bit already, but again, this is a review. The first wave is from the eastern seaboard to the west coast, again along with mostly Manifest Destiny as the U.S. acquired more land, and you have farming initially as the most majority of the U.S. economy. People are going to want to look for and claim that farmland for themselves. As the U.S. shifts the economy post-Civil War to more of an industrialized base, you're going to have people moving from the country into the city looking for those jobs because that's where the factories were located. The second wave is post-World War II, as more of the jobs are in the cities, manufacturing. African Americans are moving from the south to the north, south, and west, looking for more opportunities as jobs in farming are starting to dry up. The third wave, again, is Cold War jobs, defense jobs. So in the South, around military bases in California, West Coast, again near military installations as things were ramping up with the fight against the Soviet Union. But also, you're going to see growth in the Sun Belt because of vast amounts of land at that time, cheap labor, and at air conditioning. So you have all this kind of a perfect storm to allow businesses to relocate there. The migration in the United States from rural to urban begins in the mid-1800s as the U.S. starts to shift to a larger urban population, kind of following the trend of England, but just a little bit later. 1800, we have about 5% of a rural urban population. By 1920, we're up to 50. Right now, we're probably about 75%. So today, 3/4 of the U.S. population live in cities, as well as most of your other developed countries. Urbanization is also starting to diffuse into peripheral countries or least developed countries, particularly in Asia, where you have most of your large population centers are in major cities. Japan, the majority of their population is located in 2 or 3 major cities. China, also, their major population centers are major cities, and places like Shanghai have just boomed in the last 10 or 15 years because of that population growth, but that's where most of the jobs are. And again, following that trend, people are moving from the countryside into the city because that's where the jobs are. And some countries like China have provided economic incentives for businesses to come to major cities. China has created what they call special economic zones, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to have Western companies come in and build factories, and then they provide housing for these workers as well to bring them in to provide the labor to encourage the economic growth with these Western companies and international companies to come in. This map here shows England in 1701, and then the population density by 1911, and mostly fueled because of the Industrial Revolution. Countries forcing people to move from place to place. Russia is a classic example of that. Most of Russia's resources are in the eastern part of the country, and what they needed to do was kind of forcefully encourage people to go to where the resources are. Most of those resources are in Siberia, and Siberia is not exactly the most hospitable climate. Very extreme. It's got mild summers, but they're very short, and very extremely cold winters. There is a native population that lives in Siberia, but they are very much used to those extreme climates, temperature changes. So what the Soviets did is that they forced people they paid them extra high salaries, created camps for college kids to take a year off and go work out there, have them settle, provided them with, created almost like luxury, like resorts to have them work there, bowling alleys, movie theaters, things like that to attract them there in the middle of nowhere. But realistically, Siberia is 45% of the Soviet Union or Russia now. There's only 2% of the country's entire population. Some incentives that they offered, as I said, higher wages, paid holidays. They tried to make the conditions as nice as possible out there. It really doesn't work. So as a result, they really had to force people to go work out there. And once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it really forced the cause, not really forced, but it was pretty much the end of that interregional migration, because nobody really wanted to move out there because of the conditions, because they are so extreme. All right, Brazil is going to be a country that's a little bit more successful in that interregional migration. Historically, the two largest cities in Brazil are Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. They were both on the coast, going back to its roots in colonial days, where the Portuguese would ship all of the resources out of Brazil to Portugal and then back again. And as a result, most of your population migrated there and stayed in the cities. And what's going to happen is that the country, the government wanted to encourage people. Brazil is a very large, it's the largest country in South America. They wanted to encourage people to move inland. So in the 1960s, they're going to move the capital from Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo. And as a result, it's going to take some of that population away, but not much. The biggest thing is that there was improved housing and jobs were available, but a lot of people, based on the salaries that they had, couldn't afford the price of housing in Brazil. They've kind of adjusted since then and figured out that they needed to raise wages. So you do have more people living in Brasilia, but not as many, obviously, as in Rio or Sao Paulo. So it worked to a certain extent. But again, Brazil is a very special case where you have a forced interregional migration of trying to move the capital. Since the early 70s, the government of Indonesia has encouraged people to move from the most populated islands, such as Java, to the lesser populated islands. Indonesia is a country made up of many islands. So to encourage that and to reiterate, or at least to mention the fact that Indonesia is predominantly an agricultural nation, the government provided people with a one-way ticket, 5 acres of land, material to build your house, and a year's worth of rice. 5 million people, just at least since the 1970s, have taken the government up on this offer, and it has dispersed the population. So it has been somewhat successful, and they're hoping to continue this program. By doing so, they've dispersed some of the population, but there's still a lot more people who are crammed into a couple of the large major islands on Indonesia that could obviously be spread out, but it's a difficult thing to do. So Europe has also seen a change in its migration pattern. You see people moving into the west and the north from the east and the south, predominantly due to the stronger economic opportunities in Western and Northern Europe compared to East and Southern Europe. And this accounts a lot for just the stronger economies. Now, most of these nations are part of the EU, but again, just different approaches in government, and a lot of the countries in the East and the South were part of the former Soviet Union or attached to it. So they are kind of rebounding from years under controlled economies by the government, which is very different from the countries in the West and the North who were more based on a free market type of economy. Another situation that you have is a migration into Western Europe from their former colonies in Africa and elsewhere because people are looking for jobs, again, filling a lot of those lower paying jobs. But you also have a large influx of immigrants coming from Asia as well, again, to fill some lower paying jobs, but also some higher skill jobs as well. What you also see, the intra-regional migration that you will see worldwide, is a trend of people moving from the cities to the suburbs. So it's kind of a backwards migration. So for a long time, you've seen people moving from rural areas to the cities. But because the cities are getting so crowded, particularly in MDCs or core countries, you're seeing kind of that reverse migration. You're seeing people, wealthier folks, move out of the city into the suburbs to access more land, to maybe get a little bit quieter lifestyle, things like that. So that is kind of a new trend. It's kind of go against the what you're going to see in a lot of, say, periphery countries. In regards to that, why people are doing that, what you're going to see is in developed countries, the move from cities to the suburbs is called counter-urbanization. So again, it's going against the rise of cities. Why is it happening? A lot of it is not necessarily related to employment, but people want to change in lifestyle. They want more land, better schools, safer neighborhoods, because again, as things have changed, particularly in a lot of core countries, the education systems in major cities aren't as strong, high quality, because the tax base isn't as high, because the majority of people living in the cities don't have as high of income as in, say, maybe the suburbs. You also have a lot of, because of transportation, whether it's transit like metro or improved highways, it's easier for people to get in and out of the cities if they're working there. So that's also another encouragement of this counter-urbanization movement. Another aspect of it is the fact that a lot of companies are leaving the city and moving outside of the city. So that's another encouragement for people to be closer to work. So there are a lot of factors in play with this. All right, we're done with the lecture. You can ignore the side that says critical thinking groups. That is something for another day. And I hope you guys are ready for your quiz. Bring your questions to class, and I will help answer them for you before you take your quiz on the 13th and the 16th.